You think America is controlled by the people. But what if everything you believe is only half the truth? Because behind elections there is a system. In today's world, when people hear the name of the United States, they imagine power, freedom, and democracy. A nation built on the idea that the people are in control, where every voice matters and every vote shapes the future. But what if that image is only part of the truth? What if the real system is far more complex and far less visible? This is not a conspiracy theory. This is a deeper look into how power actually works in modern America, a system where decisions are not always as simple as they appear, and where influence often operates behind the scenes. Every 4 years, millions of people participate in elections. Leaders change, campaigns promise change, and new faces enter the spotlight. But if you look closely, something unusual begins to stand out. The system itself rarely changes. Wars continue, economic structures remain the same, corporations grow stronger, and for many ordinary citizens, life does not dramatically improve. So the question is, if leadership changes, why doesn't the system change with it? To understand this, we first need to understand what power really means. Power is not just about holding a position in government. Real power is the ability to influence outcomes, to shape economic policies, control military decisions, and guide public opinion. Whoever controls these areas holds the true power, and this is where the begin to get interesting. Because when we look beyond the surface, we begin to see that power in modern America is not concentrated in a single place. It is spread across a network, a system where government institutions, corporations, media, and military forces are all connected. On the outside, it looks like a democracy, but underneath it functions like a complex structure of influence. History gives us an important clue. From the very beginning, the foundations of the American system were shaped by individuals who were wealthy, educated, and deeply invested in protecting their interests. Their goal was not just to create a functioning government, but to create a stable system that could maintain control over time. As America evolved, so did this structure. Today, elections still exist, but running a successful campaign requires enormous financial resources. Billions of dollars are spent on advertising, media exposure, and public outreach, and most of funding does not come from ordinary citizens. It comes from powerful donors, corporations, and organized interest groups. This raises an important question. If a system depends on funding from powerful entities, can it remain completely independent from them? Imagine a politician trying to win an election. They need visibility, marketing, and media presence, and all of that requires money. Large donors provide that support. Now ask yourself, once that politician is in power, how easy is it for them to go against the interests of those who help them get there? This is how influence works. Not always direct, not always visible, but deeply embedded in the structure itself. Over time, this creates a system where decisions are shaped in ways that avoid conflict with powerful interests, and slowly the voice of the average citizen becomes just one part of a much larger equation. But government is only one part of this system. Because in modern America, there are other forces that hold enormous influence. Corporations that control industries, media organizations that shape perception, and military structures that define global strategy. Together, these elements form what we call the modern power system, a system that does not always reveal itself openly, but influences almost everything. And perhaps the most powerful part of this system is perception, because when people believe they are in control, they rarely question the structure around them. In this documentary, we will break down this system layer by layer. We will explore how power flows through corporations, how media shapes reality, and how decisions are influenced at the highest levels. And by the end, we will attempt to answer one simple, but powerful question: who really controls America? When we talk about power in the United States, the official structure seems clear. Power is divided into 3 branches: the executive, the legislative, and the judicial. The president enforces the law, Congress creates it, and the Supreme Court interprets it. This system is known as checks and balances, designed to prevent any single branch from becoming too powerful. On paper, it is one of the most carefully designed democratic systems in the world, but reality is often more complex than theory. Because while this structure defines how power is supposed to work, it does not fully explain how power actually operates in practice. At first glance, democracy appears to function as expected. Citizens vote, leaders are elected, and policies are debated and passed. But beneath this visible process lies another layer, a network of influence that shapes decisions long before they reach the public stage. One of the most important elements of this hidden layer is lobbying. In the United States, lobbying is legal, meaning corporations, organizations, and interest groups are allowed to directly communicate with lawmakers to promote their interests. On the surface, this may seem like a normal part of a democratic system, giving different groups a voice in policymaking, but the reality is not always balanced because not all voices carry the same weight. Large corporations and powerful interest groups have access to significant financial resources. They can hire experienced lobbyists, fund detailed research, and maintain constant communication with decision-makers, giving them a level of access and influence that ordinary citizens simply do not have. And influence in this system does not always need to be direct. It often works through pressure, relationships, and long-term support. Another key factor is campaign financing. Running for political office in modern America is extremely expensive. From advertising and travel to media campaigns and staff, the cost of an election can reach hundreds of millions, even billions of dollars, and this funding has to come from somewhere. While small donations from citizens do play a role, a large portion of campaign funding comes from wealthy donors, political action committees, and corporate-backed groups. This creates a dependency, because when a political career relies on continuous funding, maintaining strong relationships with major donors becomes essential. And over time, this can shape priorities, not through direct orders but through alignment of interests. Then there is what experts call the revolving door. This is a system where individuals move between roles in government and positions in private industry. A person may serve as a regulator overseeing a specific sector and later join a company within that same sector, and years later return to government again. This constant movement creates deep connections between public institutions and private interests and raises an important question. Can a system remain fully neutral when the same individuals operate on both sides of the decision-making process? Another layer of complexity comes from the nature of modern policymaking. Today's laws are often highly technical and complex, involving detailed economic models, legal language, and specialized knowledge. As a result, lawmakers rely heavily on advisors, consultants, and subject matter experts, but these experts are not always independent. In many cases, they are connected to industries that benefit directly from the policies being created. This means influence can be built into the structure of the law itself, not visible but deeply embedded. And then there is the role of bureaucracy. Within the government, there are permanent institutions and career officials who remain in place regardless of which political party is in power. While elected leaders come and go, these structures continue to operate with long-term consistency. This provides stability, but it also means that real change can be slow and difficult. Even when leadership changes, the core system often remains the same, so when we ask who really holds power, the answer becomes more complicated. It is not just elected officials, it is a system, a network where influence flows through funding, relationships, and institutional structures. Some argue that this system is necessary for stability and efficiency, while others believe it weakens true democracy by concentrating power in the hands of a few. But regardless of perspective, one thing is clear: power in modern America does not exist in a single place, it exists in layers. And to truly understand it, we must look beyond the surface, because what we see is only the visible structure, and what we do not see is where influence truly operates. If government represents visible power, then corporations represent invisible power, the kind that does not always appear in headlines but quietly shapes the direction of entire nations. In modern America, corporations are no longer just businesses, they are powerful institutions with the ability to influence economies, guide political decisions, and shape the daily lives of millions of people. Over time, corporations have grown larger, more connected, and more powerful than ever before, with some of the biggest companies controlling resources greater than the economies of entire countries. And with that level of financial strength comes leverage, the ability to influence not just markets but governments as well. This influence begins with economic dependence. Governments rely on corporations for jobs, investment, and economic growth, while corporations rely on government policies to protect their interests and allow expansion, creating a system where both sides are connected. Because of this relationship, governments must carefully design policies, avoiding decisions that could harm major corporations, since those decisions could lead to job losses, economic instability, or reduced investment. This means that even without direct control, corporations become a constant factor in decision-making, shaping outcomes through their importance to the economy. Another major channel of influence is political funding. Elections in the United States require massive financial resources, and much of that funding comes from wealthy donors, corporate-backed groups, and political action committees. This creates a system where financial power translates into political influence, allowing corporations to support candidates, shape discussions, and gain access to decision-makers long before policies are finalized. Lobbying plays a critical role in this process. Corporations employ professional lobbyists whose job is to represent their interests, meet lawmakers' present data, and suggest policies that benefit their industries. Many of these lobbyists are former government officials who understand the system from the inside, making their influence even more effective. But corporate power does not stop at politics, it extends into everyday life. Corporations control key sectors such as technology, energy, healthcare, and finance, all of which directly affect how people live, communicate, and make decisions. Technology companies manage the platforms where billions of people share information and form opinions. Financial institutions influence markets and economic conditions, and healthcare companies shape access to essential services. When these elements are combined, corporations become more than just participants in the system, they become architects of it. Supporters argue that this power drives innovation, creates jobs, and strengthens the economy, while critics argue that when profit becomes the primary goal, public interest can be pushed aside. Decisions may prioritize financial gain over environmental protection, worker welfare, or long-term stability, creating a tension between growth and responsibility. Globalization adds another layer to this system. Many corporations operate across multiple countries, giving them influence that extends beyond national borders, and in some cases making them more powerful than the governments that regulate them. This leads to a situation where governments and corporations must negotiate with each other, creating policies that are often the result of compromise rather than control. As a result, power becomes distributed across networks, instead of centralized in a single institution. So the question remains, if corporations can influence policy, shape economies, and impact global decisions, where does real power truly exist? Is it within elected offices, or within corporate boardrooms? The answer is not simple, because in modern America power is shared within a system where corporate influence and political authority are deeply connected, and this connection is what defines how the system operates behind the scenes. In a system where power depends on influence, controlling information becomes just as important as controlling decisions. Because in the modern world, people do not just respond to reality, they respond to what they believe reality is, and that belief is shaped by media. In theory, media exists to inform the public, to present facts, hold power accountable, and give people the information they need to make informed decisions. But in practice, the role of media is far more complex. Media is not just a source of information, it is also a business, and like any business, it depends on revenue, audience attention, and financial survival. This creates a tension between truth and engagement, because the content that attracts attention is often emotional, dramatic, and simplified. Stories that create fear, conflict, or excitement tend to spread faster, while complex or neutral information often receives less attention. Over time, this shapes how events are presented and how they are understood. Another important factor is ownership. Many major media organizations are owned by large corporations, and while this does not always mean direct control, it introduces influence, because corporate priorities can affect which stories are highlighted and which are ignored. This influence often works through selection rather than direct orders, shaping narratives by deciding what is shown and how it is framed. Repetition is another powerful tool. When the same message is repeated across multiple platforms, it begins to feel like truth, and when something feels widely accepted, it becomes harder to question. This creates a perception of reality that may not fully reflect the complete picture. With the rise of digital media, this system has become even more complex. Social media platforms, online news, and algorithm-driven content now control how information is distributed. At first, this appears to increase freedom, giving more voices the ability to share information, but it also introduces new challenges. Algorithms are designed to maximize engagement, showing users content that keeps them watching and interacting, which often means prioritizing emotional or controversial material over balanced information. As a result, different groups of people may be exposed to completely different versions of reality, each reinforced by the content they consume. This leads to division, confusion, and competing narratives, where truth becomes harder to define. In this environment, the question is no longer just what is happening, but what people are being shown and what they are not being shown. Because silence can be just as powerful as information, what is not reported can shape perception just as much as what is. When media shapes perception, perception influences belief, belief influences behavior, and behavior influences outcomes. This is why media is considered one of the most powerful forces in modern society. Not because it directly controls everything, but because it shapes how everything is understood. And when understanding is shaped, decisions naturally follow that perception, making media a central part of the modern power system. In every powerful nation, the military plays a central role in shaping both national security and global influence. But in modern America, the military is not just a defense system. It is part of a much larger network known as the military-industrial complex. This system connects the armed forces, defense contractors, political institutions, and economic interests into a single structure where each part depends on the other. The government relies on private companies to produce weapons, technology, and defense systems, while those companies depend on government contracts for profit and growth, creating a cycle where military spending becomes both a security necessity and an economic driver. The United States maintains one of the largest defense budgets in the world, investing billions and even trillions of dollars over time into military development, research, and global operations. This level of spending supports industries, creates jobs, and drives technological advancement. But it also creates incentives, because when entire sectors of the economy depend on defense spending, reducing that spending becomes difficult. Defense contractors play a key role in this system, operating as private businesses that design and supply military equipment, from aircraft and weapons systems to cybersecurity and advanced technology. Their success depends on securing long-term contracts, which encourages strong relationships with policymakers and decision-makers. This is where influence becomes part of the system, not always through direct control but through necessity, expertise, and ongoing cooperation. Another important factor is long-term planning. Military programs often take years or even decades to develop, and once they begin, they create infrastructure, employment, and financial commitments that are difficult to reverse. Canceling such programs can affect local economies, jobs, and political support, creating momentum that keeps the system moving forward even when circumstances change. On a global level, the United States maintains a widespread military presence, with bases, alliances, and operations across different regions. Supporting this global network requires constant resources, logistics, and coordination, much of which is provided through partnerships with private industry, further strengthening the connection between military power and economic interests. The most complex aspect of this system is its relationship with conflict. Military operations increase demand for equipment, services, and technology, activating the entire system and reinforcing its importance. This does not mean conflicts are created intentionally for profit, but it does mean that when conflicts occur, they support a structure that is already in place and capable of expanding. This raises a critical question. When economic interests, political decisions, and military strategies are interconnected, can decisions remain purely focused on security, or do other factors begin to influence outcomes? Supporters argue that this system ensures readiness, innovation, and global stability, while critics warn that it can normalize high levels of military spending and continuous global engagement, potentially making conflict more sustainable than peace. The military-industrial complex is not a single entity, but a network where government, industry, and military priorities intersect, shaping decisions through a combination of strategy, economics, and long-term planning. And once again, the question returns, where does real power exist? In the decisions of leaders or in the systems that influence those decisions? Because when power is distributed across networks, it becomes harder to see, harder to define, and even harder to control. In every system of power, There is one element that determines its strength more than anything else, and that element is perception. Because power does not only depend on control, it depends on belief. If people believe they are free, they behave differently than if they believe they are controlled, and in modern systems this belief becomes one of the most powerful tools of all. In the United States, citizens are given rights, choices, and the ability to participate in the political process. Elections, free speech, and public to all create the appearance of control, and these elements are real. But the question is not whether they exist, the question is how much they influence the final outcome. Because participation does not always equal control. Voting gives people a voice, but influence depends on how that voice interacts with the larger system. And as we have seen, that system includes corporations, media, political funding, and long-standing institutional structures, all of which shape decisions long before they reach the public. This creates a situation where individuals feel empowered, but the direction of the system remains largely consistent. This is what some analysts describe as the illusion of control, not because people have no power, but because their power operates within defined boundaries. A system can allow choice while still limiting outcomes, offering multiple options that lead to similar results, making people feel like they are deciding the future, even when the overall direction remains unchanged. This does not require direct manipulation. It works through structure, design, and the way choices are presented. Another important factor is distraction. Modern life is filled with constant information, entertainment, and activity. News cycles move quickly, social media demands attention, and new content appears every second, creating a continuous flow of information, but very little time for deep thinking. In such an environment, it becomes difficult to step back and question the system as a whole. Attention is always shifting, and when focus is fragmented, understanding becomes limited. At the same time, emotional narratives play a powerful role. Stories are presented in ways that trigger strong reactions such as fear, anger, pride, or hope. These emotions drive engagement but also simplify complex issues into clear positions, even when reality is far more complicated. Identity further strengthens this effect. People connect with ideas that reflect who they are, whether political, social, or cultural identity. And once identity becomes involved, perspectives become stronger and harder to change. This creates division where different groups interpret the same events in completely different ways, each believing they are correct. When people are focused on opposing each other, they are less likely to question the system itself. This is how the illusion of control is maintained, not through force but through perception, structure, and constant engagement. People participate, react, debate, and choose sides, while the system continues to operate in a consistent direction. However, this does not mean people have no power. Collective awareness, critical thinking, and informed action can influence change, but that requires understanding. It requires the ability to see beyond surface-level narratives and question how and why things happen. Because once perception is understood, the system becomes clearer. And when the system becomes clear, illusion begins to fade. At the beginning of this journey, we asked a simple question: who really controls America? And now, after exploring government structures, corporate influence, media dynamics, military power, and the illusion of control, the answer is no longer simple. Because power in modern America is not held by a single person, institution, or group. It exists within a network, a system of interconnected forces where government, corporations, media, and military structures all influence one another. No single entity has absolute control, but together they create a structure that is powerful, stable, and difficult to change. This is not a system built on obvious control. It is built on balance, a balance between influence, interests, and long-term stability. And within this balance, decisions are shaped not by one force but by the interaction of many. This is why change often feels slow, why different leaders can produce similar outcomes, and why policies evolve while the system itself remains consistent. Because the system is designed to sustain itself, to adapt without collapsing, and to adjust without losing control. This raises an important question. If no single group controls everything, does that mean no one is responsible? Or does it mean responsibility is shared across the system? The truth is, this structure reflects power and limitation. It allows stability but resists change. It enables growth but can preserve inequality. And it protects interests while limiting transformation. Within this complexity, the role of the individual becomes more important than ever, because while systems shape outcomes, people shape systems. Awareness is the first step. Understanding how power works allows individuals to move beyond surface-level perception, to recognize influence, question narratives, and think critically. The second step is engagement, not just participation but informed participation, asking deeper questions and seeking real understanding instead of accepting simple explanations. The third step is perspective, recognizing that systems are not fixed, they evolve over time, and history has shown that change is possible when awareness grows. But change does not happen automatically. It requires effort, clarity, and people who are willing to look beyond what is presented and understand what is actually happening. So is the United States truly free, or is it a carefully structured system of control? The answer lies somewhere in between. It is a system of freedom operating within a structure of influence, where people have a voice, but that voice exists within a larger network of power. And understanding that balance is the key, because once you understand how the system works, you no longer see it the same way again. You begin to recognize patterns, question assumptions, and most importantly, think for yourself. And maybe that is where real power truly begins.